Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another Moxtober daily wrap up. For those of you who don't know what Moxtober is, it's an annual event where for each day of the month of October, there's a unique one word prompt based on which people perform creative endeavors related to the game of Magic the Gathering. Most people make custom cards, which is what we're going to be looking at today, but people also write articles, do art, make their own deck lists, anything creative related to the game. I'm joined today by Bradley Rose, Mark Confidant, and Ancestral of MTG.design. As always, if you want designer credits for all of the cards we talk about today, they're linked in the description, as well as the MTG.design and MSC files we source these cards from, and instructions on how you can submit your cards to those files to potentially be considered for future wrap-ups. But with that out of the way, I think we can get into our first card. Um, and I'll start us off with from the MSC file, it's going to be Lay the Mines, designed by Epid. So it's pretty simple. It's one red for target opponent conjures 4 detonate cards on top of their library, then shuffles their library. You might be wondering, what is a detonate? Is that a cannon card? And nope, it's also there in the file. It's a card that says cast this card when you draw it. It deals 4 damage to you, but it cantrips into another card, so it doesn't waste your draw. Um, and I feel like Conjure is something that's recently just been added into the game with the advent of Jumpstart Horizons, or no, not Jumpstart Horizons, Historic Horizons, which explores like digital play space. And if you ever played Slay the Spire, this gives me like a big vibe of like the curses in that game, where you shuffle cards into your opponent's library that have negative effects. I'm not gonna lie, I'm not sure about the balancing rate on this because I think that for one red, being able to put 4 mostly strictly better spikes into your opponent's library um, probably does not lead to great gameplay slash might not be super balanced. But I like the exploration of new mechanics, and I think it really gives that feeling of paranoia of like, oh man, um, every draw is a potential actual minefield. So
Oh, this reminds me of been doing. Let's see, I think a few months ago, playing Legends of Runeterra, where you can plant something similar called the poisonous mushrooms into a deck, and it tags it to cards that you draw, and then so you're like, whenever comes to your turn and your opponent has put mushrooms in, it's just like, oh boy, okay, is this gonna be when I maybe take a lot of damage or not? And it's nice to have that like suspenseful, dangerous feeling for each of your draws instead of just that every one of your draws is always a good thing. In this case, maybe not.
There's a lot of digital card games that try this sort of thing, just because the digital space is able to have the rules engine of the game act as kind of a neutral arbiter of this sort of thing. In paper, it's kind of fiddly because, a person could leave this in their hand. It kind of creates a situation where at the end of a match, you're forced to reveal your hand. The way you reveal morphs, it's kind of difficult along those lines. I do enjoy, like Bradley was saying, the idea of these things in particular because usually in Magic, your draw step is the thing that is like your one hope for improving if you're behind. And so you have this situation where rather than just being a way for you to, if you're ahead, get further ahead, or if you're behind, bail yourself out, there's this fear of like, oh, I'm doing badly, and then also there's this chance that they've set up my deck so that the thing that would save me won't even save me anymore. Or there's this thing of like, oh, I'm ahead, but if I just run a runner into 2 of these detonates, then I'll go from being ahead and winning this race to being miles behind and probably just straight up dead. And it's a really interesting way to create this extra tension and extra interestingness. Although maybe a little bit frustrating just because the deck is always your one saving grace.
I
mm,
think there was a mystery booster where we had something like this. Trying to remember what the card was. It was like a dead card where you could cycle for a bunch of mana.
Oh yeah, the slimes.
And the what was it?
They were like, it was a slime that made like oozes or gunk or something or junk.
Yeah, it was like junk or literally something like gunk. Yeah. So I don't know if I apologize here. What when it talks about detonate cards, what are those?
It's a
Other card.
it's a 0 mana red instant. Cast this card when you draw it. It deals 4 damage to you, and you draw a card.
Okay. So kind of a similar premise. Obviously, a little bit more painful. So basically, 4 dead draws, or you can cycle for quite the hefty cost there, and 1 red mana. I don't know. Maybe this would slow down a lot of decks. I could see that for 1 red mana, especially in a spells heavy red deck. Maybe this just kind of stalls the game. I don't know if it's necessarily good gameplay. Like a lot of times, Magic games, can go on too long, but I do like the idea. Also, a lot of shuffling. Well, maybe not. I guess you're just shuffling once to put the conjured cards on top.
Ooh,
And you mentioned
another
this.
cool thing.
Go ahead.
Another cool thing is that red is the one that embraces randomness the most. So the flavor of "Will you step on a mine" is very apt here.
Oh, sure. Right.
Gambling your lightning bolt, or what's the red modern spell? Aim it only at players and it has arcane.
Lava spike.
Yeah.
Lava, yeah. Instead of a lava spike, you gotta lay the mines. Then you might get lucky.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, and talking about slimes reminded me. There's a set called Arcanum Academia where you conjure. It's colorless sorceries where you can pay that cost 2, and they just have draw a card, called Fatigue. And that set, usually what it does is you put Fatigue on top of your library as an additional cost. So it's like it makes your next spell cost 2 more, but then in addition, it's sort of like a pseudo kicker, or you get some stronger effect head on rate. But there's also like certain cards which puts them on top of your opponent's library, and there's not a lot of them, but I think that would be interesting space to explore as like a pseudo taxing for draws.
What I really want to see here is a randomness of like actual land mines. So like I think it would be fantastic where you draw, and if you drew the mine, then you take the damage. But if you didn't draw the mine, then whew, okay, but maybe it's the next one. And I kind of feel like I almost kind of want that kind of effect where you might draw the bad card or you might not, instead of just kind of always knowing the top 4.
That's fair. Here it does shuffle them in, but yeah, Fatigue normally.
Okay. So I was a little confused here. So okay, that's exactly the gameplay that I was looking for. I was a little confused. I thought it was just being put on top. You're shuffling the rest, but you're actually shuffling the whole thing. Very cool.
Oh yeah, no, because otherwise that would be 1 red deals 16 damage, which would be
right.
a bit.
Or 4 dead draws, right? So I totally misread that at first.
One critique I heard of those like dead draw cards, I'm forgetting who said it, but they talked about how like the thing that is kind of interesting about the ones where you have to cycle it away, but maybe makes them look less, or makes the play pattern less fun, is when they're powerful in your opponent's hand, you don't really see them being powerful. Like if you shuffle them in, you don't really see them, and if they're in your opponent's hand and they're the only thing that your opponent can do, then yeah, they cycle them away. But when they're in your opponent's hand and they come at the opportunity cost of other stuff, there's like a couple little like fences between you and understanding how strong they were in that moment. There's the fence of like you don't get to see your opponent's hand, and then there's the fence of like probabilistically you don't know what it's coming at the expense of.
Yeah, those all make sense. Okay, next up, Bradley. What is going to be your first card of the day?
All right, let's go to mtg.design. There's a land called Grove of Whispers. It's cool to have, like, the Grove of Whispers ability requires just some setup over time, where you have to use the tap symbol at least 3 times there because you need to get 3 omens on it. And that necessitates or that facilitates the starting your a feeling of like this is coming, and you couldn't have just not slow rolled this out. So you are just like thinking about, all right, what are the creatures I have to worry about eventually? And I like how that makes that feeling that you get, and that whatever you don't want to see the most, it's likely not going to be the case unless it's like the same creature card. But yeah, so it's it's a unique sort of experience when you slow roll it out like that.
Yeah, I like this a lot. It's one of those things where like you have to invest at least 3 turns into this, so it's only coming into play in slow games. You don't really get to choose, even if they have like one big beater, there's not like a guarantee that you're going to be getting that. Um, but abilities on lands are powerful, and this gives a lot of, as a mana sink in the late game, gives you a lot of cool stuff to be able to do. Because there's definitely lots of situations where you're top decking, where you can spare like 4 mana, or the only thing that you're doing is like swinging with a 2/2 go or something in like lots of grindy matchups. So I can see this being like super cool. And again, I think it fits the. I think a few people did like, "What's in the forest over there?" type of cards, and I love that flavor for today's prompt.
What do you think of the idea of just scrapping the omen counters and instead having the clause be if 3 or more creatures with different names are exiled by this, then you can sack it to maximize the requirement for there to be like variance or mysteriousness or unknownness in what is going to come out of it.
I think you can just do if there are 3 or more cards exiled with this and scrap the omen
Mhm.
counters. I think different names is a knob you can add, but since it has to be from an opponent's graveyard, I think that it's not as important slash relevant because it's not because I think if you could target yourself, you could easily set up like piles where it doesn't matter what you random into. I think as it stands, I think that adding the differently named would just be adding more hoops to a card that I don't think needs it.
I agree with removing omen counters with just saying when you've exiled 3 cards. I think that's great. And Caillou, I think you're right in that it's uh, the amount of bonus you get by forcing the different names is probably unnecessary, especially if I imagine this is printed in a multiplayer product, whether it's Commander or Plane Chase next or something. This you will probably end up with 3 different anyway.
I think multiplayer this would be a lot of fun, especially if there's like a board wipe or something where you have a board wipe spell in your hand. With more players, there's going to be more targets, more good targets. So this, yeah, nothing much else to add here. It seems like there's a good chance you could get something good, but I guess if you really need to get to 3, sometimes you're just gonna have to exile whatever's there and just hope you don't randomly get that on your battlefield.
Okay, next up, Mark. What is your first card for the day going to be?
My first card for the day is You Hear a Noise. It's 1 a green and a blue for an instant. As an additional cost to cast this spell, tap an untapped creature you control. Choose 1. X is the mana value of the creature tapped to pay this spell's additional cost. And then it has flavor words. Search the area. You gain half X life and draw half X cards. Round down each time. Or Must Be the Wind. Counter target spell with mana value X or less. I feel like this is just a very evocative way of doing this sort of effect. Or like this sort of charm that they concepted out. And I wouldn't have thought of this for Paranoia, and I wouldn't have thought of this as a charm. And there's just like a lot of kind of complicated constituent pieces here put together into something that like surprises me and that I like quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, shout out to HonchkrowDavid for this design. Um, And I think they may have stumbled on on the flavor idea because I know they've made quite a few Skyrim inspired sets. Uh, I think this art may even be like no, it's not from Scrolls Legends, but like it's definitely somewhere adjacent to that. So I think that they're probably working on one of those projects. Saw the Moxtober prompt and was like, huh, yeah, this kind. I since I have this rattling around, this comes to mind. So
I appreciate that you're able to use this card even when there's no spell to counter. There's another thing that you can do when you're like, oh, my reward for uh like you have to have a creature that's untapped, right? So it can be a feel bad if you're like, okay, just in case I'll hold back on this creature and not attack with it. But it turns out the opponent just was gonna pass anyway, and you're like, ah, dang. But at least if you want to maximize your mana for the whole round, that turn round, you can still search the area.
mhm. I can definitely see this being interesting slash useful in some sort of flash deck. Um, you probably do want something that like tops out at 4, like something that has like a night pack ambusher where it's either like, well, I can counter most things they can bring out, or I'm using this as an instant speed 3 mana divination. So
What's really interesting here is that, and maybe this is a nod to the Simic jellyfish that we had from was it Rafting Allegiance, Guilds of Ravnica?
Hydroid
But
phrases.
yeah, because the tapping an untapped creature is part of the cost. So that's important because if it wasn't and your opponent removed the creature, then you wouldn't get anything on the card. But if they remove the creature after you cast the spell, you still gain life and draw cards or counter a spell, unless they counter this spell. But assuming that the spell isn't countered, removing the creature doesn't matter. And that could be a factor, like if you're going to lose a creature in combat, or even if there wasn't, if it was just if your opponent was just like, no, I don't want you to draw those cards. And the jellyfish was the same kind of way, where I guess slightly different, where like if you countered it, it didn't really matter because it was a cast trigger.
Yeah, it mitigates the loss that you have there. Yeah, that's a good point.
Still
Um,
kind of interesting, and it's very defensive, right? So I mean, I think I don't know if there's ever a correct way to play an instant, but this definitely seems like um going out in blazes sort of spell. My opponent is about to exile or destroy my guy, so one last hurrah.
One thing I think that you were talking about there that I think is really important that a lot of designers undervalue is choosing how you do sequencing of effects, or whether things are a cost or whether they're just an operation that happens during the spell, and whether something's an end of the battlefield ability or a replacement effect that changes how a thing enters the battlefield. These are all really subtle knobs, but can be very important depending on the spell. Like looting effects, if they have their discard as an additional cost, it becomes kind of fraught to cast them into counter magic. In the same sort of vein, if they don't have discard as a cost, you can cast them when you're hellbent and they just become draw spells.
Okay, ancestral. What is your first card for the day going to be?
Sure thing. So I'm gonna go with a pretty simple design here. But I think sometimes the simple designs are some of the best designs. So this is Paranoid Giant. This is on MTG.design. Paranoid Giant, 3 and a red. It's a giant. It can only attack or block alone. It's a 5/5. I think actually this could easily be a common. But I think when you think of someone who's paranoid, it's oftentimes when you're paranoid, you're oftentimes unwilling to work with other people, and I think the art is pretty great at showing this very angry giant, I guess. And actually, I do see some wolves kind of in the area, but the whole point here is that you're not doing things with other people. You're very much a loner.
It's a specific flavor, I guess, since you can be paranoid about anything really. But I guess this person prefers to be alone and doesn't trust peeps. And I think that's cool because Red has had this history of cards of like can't attack or block alone, but sometimes, yeah, they've played in this space multiple times. I think the last time was back in um, Call Time. Yes, with
Kaldheim had a card that was actually
the
the
giant
opposite,
coward.
right? The Craven Hulk, where it can't block alone. So maybe
Yeah,
there's a nod
correct.
there, but
Yeah, and then there's the Ember Beast thing or whatever, can't attack alone. Not Ember Beast,
Mhm.
is it? Yeah, there's another one where it's like a can't attack alone. It shows like a handler sort of thing with the creature. So this is cool. It combines both of them.
Weirdly, if I were putting this into a set, like an existing Magic set, I'd probably want it somewhere in like a Lara block because it actually fits really well into playing nicely with both Exalted and the 5/5s matter theme there. Um, it's just kind of random, but those where my mind went as far as things go. Also, am I the only person who always forgets whether block alone means it can't block with any other creature or that it and another creature can't double block? I feel like I always forget which specifically that means and have to look it
I
up.
think I know what you're saying. Right.
I,
Yeah. I was gonna say, I'm sure it means that when it comes time to block, you must, if you're going to choose this creature, you must choose another creature. But I hear what you're saying. You're saying, well, is this saying that I need two? It has to block with the same creature with another creature, right? Like if I want to block this fire elemental, I have to block with this creature and something else. But uh, sometimes syntax can be kind of funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, speaking of simple designs, I definitely appreciate this from Moxtober Cube because I'm like, wow, Windmill Slam common, let's go. So thank you, GreyLotus. And yeah. So then for my next card, uh, let's do a little bit of a switch up in the MSC file, Friendly Neighbor. Um, and this is 1 green for a 2/2 vigilance. If an opponent would investigate, they gain 2 life instead. And I love this as there's a lot of things that I like about this flavorfully. It's like mechanically a hate bear, and there's a bear in the art, but you have a little human who's the bear's neighbor instead. Um, and it kind of like it's almost like the anti-paranoia card where it's like, yeah, there's nothing to see here. Why would you investigate when we can just all chill out and have a good time? Um, I think that if this was a little broader, like I think that it's one of those things where like it just I don't know that it would be like crazy useful in implementation unless your set is really clue heavy, but it's it was something that flipped the script on what I was expecting from people to bring today, and that's why I really appreciate it.
So I have a question about the flavor here because the way I read it is like instead of being really wholesome, I read it as really unwholesome. It's like, oh, don't look too closely into things here.
Mm-hmm.
Like they're like, oh, I'm gonna investigate your farm or something like that. It's like, no, 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 no. Shut up. Go away. Have some cookies and leave.
Yeah, I think you can flavor it that way, but I think that the art is what really sold me on this is supposed to be wholesome versus I think that you could really easily like find art that's a little more sinister, like say like old lady with a smile on her face holding a python and behind her in the doorway there's like tentacles coming out. I know that that's an art out there somewhere. So like but I think that yeah, I think the art specifically sells me on this is supposed to be a little more wholesome.
I do see it that same way, Mark. But at the same time, I also see it as it's just a 2/2 with vigilance. Like and just it's sort of like trolling you. Like there must be something more to this card. What's going on with this card? What else is this card doing? I don't understand. And this is literally it. It's sort of like you have people come to a commander table and you just have a bunch of vanilla creatures or something like that. It's like what you see is what you get.
I definitely get that sort of like Charlie Day in front of the board with all the twine on it sort of thing of like, well, there's got to be something more going on. Why does this creature have vigilance if it doesn't want you to be investigating or something like that? That level of like paranoid witching.
I like that. I keep confusing myself that this is the human person and not the bear because of the stats, and I love that I get confused just because I see Tutu and the art bear. I'm like, this is a bear. Oh wait, and it's not the bear, um, I definitely see that this could be like this is either like the best, like this is a children's book, nothing is wrong here, and I love that for that as well. I also love if we were in like two set block land, the amount like the removal of any sinisterness in the art, where if you otherwise you would have stuff like harmless offering and you could kind of see in the shadow the cat has a tail that's not cool. um that if you had a second set of the block, you would like now get into the how so creepy this is, like Get Out vibes, where it's like this is not right. Like everything is too yeah.
Ooh, you could reprint it with a different art just in the following set.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think oh they did that with Colossal Dreadmont, didn't they? Yeah. That's was that one of the cards they printed back to back?
I think there was a zombie they printed back to back in Amonkhet blocks,
Yeah.
and oh gosh, a Yeti that they printed in Cons and Dragons.
If an opponent would gain exactly 2 life, they investigate instead. I'm just kidding. All right. Props for the feelings.
Yeah, shout out MBtree for this design. Next up, what's your next card, Bradley?
Oh, let's go for another simple card in the Magic Set Editor location. Let's go for Alone in the Dark. Okay, so this card here rewards you for exactly 1 creature on your side of the field. So, because it costs 4, it's reasonable that you might get into a situation where, um, so that yeah, there's 2 things. So if you don't draw it yet, your opponent has enough time to have 2 or more creatures, but there is still a chance to be like, yes, I got it just in time. If they played their 2-drop, their suspicious friendly neighbor, you were able to still cast it for 2, and that feels great. But there's still like that chance of like, all right, you're now able to enter the mode of 2 or more creatures. Okay, good. Now once you've entered that mode, now I'm like afraid maybe to trade if I have 2 creatures on the battlefield because I know that it might enable my opponent's Alone in the Dark to cost 2 less. And I think that's a really cool feeling that I have where I might not normally want to trade and instead just either not attack or just let it through and hit me.
It feels very horror movie to imagine like the situation where your opponent has like 1 or 2 other removal spells and Alone in the Dark, and because Alone in the Dark gets cheaper, they're able to fire them all off in sequence. So you can imagine like you're attacking in with like 3 creatures or something like that, and they just go like kill spell, Alone in the Dark, and it would feel like when you split up in a horror movie and like one person vanishes and then the other person vanishes and the last person's like, oh no, and then the killer comes up behind them.
I really love the art here. It's so funny because I totally did not see that beast in the background, and now I'm like, oh yeah, there it is.
Yes, that happened to me too. I saw the central figure, looked down at the text box,
Mm-hmm.
and then went back up to the art, and then I went, oh, jeez. There it is.
I think this could potentially be a common. I think that 4 mana removal is typically pretty fine, and it has a minor upside. I don't know. Maybe the upside is a little bit too great.
Yeah, I think the thing is, like, as a common, it might, like, I agree, it's kind of straddling the line between common and uncommon. And I would advocate for uncommon a little bit, because if you
Sure.
draft these en masse, then you could more easily enable its condition, and thus, like,
Yeah, and it could shut down games. Actually, you've convinced me. I think it is better as an uncommon. Just because initially I was just like, boy, two mana destroy the only creature that an opponent has. This is the other. I'm going to roll over, run the other person over during this game. So you're probably right.
yeah, I think one
think
way
it-
to think of it is, like, it's kind of like a diabolic edict with a kicker, almost.
Hmm. I was going to say, I think that qualitatively, whether this is a common or uncommon is super duper set dependent. It depends a lot on like how frequent is the token production in the set, how like graveyard recursive is the set, how much do you care about things being removed versus like how wide versus tall is the environment of the set. All of these things contribute to this sort of question of whether like this spell that will ice one creature very efficiently, but when things start to get into a wider game becomes a lot less effective, being super duper contextual.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like, if you have like a goblin fodder at common, all of a sudden that this is like, yeah, okay, pretty safely at common, or like a raise the alarm. Um,
I could see in the most recent Innistrad set, subbing out Defenestrate for this, and like both of them at common are just fine in that set. Well, I mean, Defenestrate's pretty darn good at common, but yeah.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Okay, Mark, what's your next card gonna be?
Um, let's see here. This is one it was a little rough as far as designs go, but I really enjoyed it. On mtg.design, there's a man in the woods. Um, it's a black and a green for a sorcery. And while searching your library for a land, you may instead search for There's a Man in the Woods. If There's a Man in the Woods would enter the battlefield, pay 1 black green and cast it instead. Otherwise, exile it. Um, create a 3/4 black and green Nightmare Beast token with Fear. I just like the idea of making like going and finding a land into a threatening thing here. Um, I wouldn't mind if it specified swamp or forest instead of land in general. Um, or maybe I would, because that gets a little confusing. Where if you're searching for a basic land, does it count as searching for a swamp or forest? Um, Whatever. Regardless, it's just enough of a brain bender for me to really enjoy the concept of like sneaking out this threat. Um, I'm not sure what's the best way to do this as far as things go, because like this version of implementing it is pretty rough, even though the concept I think is quite enjoyable.
I think this is quite clever. I think most of the tutoring effects. I mean, we'll just ignore pre-modern Magic, but tutoring effects are usually cost quite a bit more, and you do have to pay in order to put this onto the battlefield. In fact, I don't know. Maybe this isn't that attractive. I like the flavor nod that it has fear, although we don't really use that keyword much anymore. But the fact that it has fear, it's somewhat unblockable.
I I like that your evolving wilds late game is not really exciting, but this ensures you got some excitement still left for your evolving wilds.
That's true. Yeah, I guess if you had yeah, right, if you had a land fetch later in the game.
Okay, ancestral. What is your next card gonna be?
All right, this is in both. This is Incite Paranoia, 1 blue. It's a sorcery. Exile a non-land card from your hand, and when an opponent casts a spell that shares a card type with it, you can reveal it and then counter that spell. And if you do, then you can cast the exiled spell, or it goes to your graveyard. And I think this is kind of fun because it's really chaotic. Your opponent doesn't know what kind of card you're exiling it, and I think in certain matchups this could be a lot of fun. So if you knew your opponent, the more that you know about your opponent's deck, the better this card is. So if it's a very creature heavy deck, then maybe you want to exile a creature from your hand. If your opponent has more spells heavy stuff, then you want to exile a spell. If you have an artifact creature, then even better. You can counter either an artifact or a creature that your opponent plays. So this is really cool. I think it's an excellent way of using hidden information, and it captures paranoia. Because your opponent just doesn't know what's going to happen. They don't know what spell might get countered.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of from the plot episode. There was that enchantment, um, and I remember one of the suggestions there was have it be type locked, and this is kind of that. It's very similar to that, where it's like they you get a type locked kind of pre-free counterspell, um, but on the condition that if you're like you need to keep mana up to cast the spell, otherwise you're going card negative in order to do so.
I really love that you have to keep mana up in this case because I think it sucks to just be able to you're always having to play around something and your opponent can just keep playing if you're able to have the effect otherwise let you cast it I don't know until the end of your next turn or cast it for free. Instead you have to do the opponent gets to act or if the opponent does the Incite Paranoia, I mean, they get to make the decision: do I flip now or later? Maybe they chose to play their creature down, and if you yourself got to sneak in a spell that matches the face down, you may next time may that actually could have matched, but you didn't know, and they didn't flip it over because they didn't have the mana. Maybe they had one or two, but the
Yep.
next time you think you're safe, maybe yeah, then they do turn it up, and you're like, ah, geez, okay, it was that the whole time.
It's interesting as the player who's casting this because you have this like tension of like wanting to exile the right card, but then also wanting to make sure that you aren't disrupting your own game plan. So if you're afraid of some like instant of theirs, but you have like a murder effect, you might be afraid of exiling it because you think that they might play around it and tie up this card forever. Um, there's a tension to that as far as things go that you have to like as the player casting this spell, you have to plan out very effectively what your game plan is going to be. And then as the player playing around this spell, you also have to try and play this like bizarro world version of Go Fish with them. Or like try and force through something early that you think is not the card type, and then later on dance around with or force through something early that you think is the card type that you're afraid of, and then afterwards dance around with the card types that you're betting that they didn't set aside.
Yeah, I don't remember who it was. I think it was you, Mark, who was talking about like enjoying mini games within Magic, and I might be misremembering that, but I do like the fact that this creates an interesting mini game within the game, but that doesn't disrupt the flow of playing Magic the Gathering. It just adds an additional layer of what you need to consider or how you want to sequence stuff. So yeah,
Yeah,
just
and also the complexity isn't only on like the like either of the players. There's a lot of complexity to what you choose, but there's also a lot of complexity what's happening afterwards because you're like doing an extra layer of playing around counter magic as the player who's not casting this, and then you're like pre-prepping your future game plan as the player who's casting it. Yeah.
And it's also cool that if there's a failsafe in the end, you don't feel bad if they play the game-ending spell and you had all your lands tapped, and it does match what you have face down, but you can't cast it, but you can still turn it up anyway. That's fine. They play a Craterhoof Behemoth, you have a Sakura Tri-Builder face down, but you cast your Sun Titan last turn. That's okay. Still flip up your Sakura Tri-Builder, counter that Craterhoof. You don't get a Sakura Tri-Builder. I know, it's very low value. Find your own another Titan. You don't get the other Titan, that's fine. You would have lost otherwise.
For sure. Like, having what is effectively 0 mana interaction, because on like later turns, definitely can help. Like, otherwise you're like, well, that does suck, but if I hadn't done this before, I wouldn't have been able to tap out for my own Titan and then still have interaction up. So, that's just how the cookie crumbles. But yeah, my next card is going to be from the MSC file, and it's going to be Overstocked Armory. And I think that this is a very functional design, but also one where I really appreciate how they captured or approached the flavor of being paranoid. It's designed by Galvanic, and it's 4 for an artifact. Each equipment card you own that isn't on the battlefield has madness. Madness cards equal to its mana cost, and you can play 1 blue and a red to draw up to 3 cards and then discard that many cards. So it allows you to quickly loot through your library, but potentially get card advantage by casting those equipment. And the idea being that, like, it's kind of representing a kingdom or a town where they're so afraid of being attacked that they're like, oh man, I need to be able to, like, they have more weapons than is even logically necessary. I almost wish this also allowed you to activate equipment costs at instant speed, so you could do funky stuff with that activated ability. You madness in an equipment and then attach it on attacks. I think that, like, given the overhead cost you're paying, I think that would be a fine buff. But overall, yeah, I really appreciate the flavor and design. So shout out to Galvanic.
I was actually going to say just about the exact same thing. Although rather than having it be like you can attach at instant speed, just giving your equipment that staple on ability that they've been doing, where things can enter the battlefield and attach on then.
Oh yeah, yeah, pretty much the same thing, but without the whatever that Meriden creature is.
Yeah, and there's a lot easier ways to if you wanted a Colossus Hammer break it, there's obviously a lot easier and cheaper ways to do it. So those interactions end up being more fun than, like, oh, this is enabling really fast stuff. So yeah, I'm on board for the free attach on ETB.
The Colossus Hammer metric. You're like, all right, does this make what you can do already with Colossus Hammer better, or is it on par? You're like, okay, all right, as long as you don't make it too good with Colossus Hammer.
You must be this colossal to ban.
Yeah. Turn 1 Colossus Hammer, probably too. Your equipment design is probably too strong. Go back to drawing board.
Mm-hmm.
Do you guys think Colossus Hammer is, like, messed up in the context of just being a card that has very little fair use case? Because I feel like it does this, like, obviously, like, it's a card that exists for synergy, but I feel like it threatens to make a lot of, like, reasonable equipment effects that you want to make more dangerous.
Kind of, but I almost feel like equipment and equipment synergies are reasonably weak anyways, so though it does provide that kind of, like, spaghetti-o, have to balance around this kind of point, I think it does so for a card type and archetype that is mostly fringe. So I'm like, it's like, as far as I understand, like, even most of the Hammer Time decks are like they're like mostly they're not against the odds, but they're not tearing either. So they're just kind of like explosive and fun, but not consistent enough to go really ham. I think that's a good.
That's
Oh, sorry. Go
that's
ahead.
not accurate actually. Modern right now, Hammer Time is probably within the top 5 decks in the metagame.
Wild. Okay, I didn't. I do not know when that happened.
I think some combination of Stoneforge and what's it called? The Urza Saga and there's an artificer
Ah,
from the D&D set. Those cumulatively kind of glom together to make Hammer Time much more efficient.
gotcha. Yeah, Stoneforge Mystic just good as a backup way to cheat out equipment. But yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
And 4 extra hammers with the Saga.
yep, yep. But yeah, and then I think that's just in that case that's just kind of that's less on Colossus Hammer and more on like, wow, we have a lot of cards that kind of support artifacts or just are very strong in, or like overtune in their own right, and that's just kind of where modern lands. So yeah.
Yeah, something in the mono gray archetype will get scary eventually, you know.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, Bradley, what is your next card going to be?
All right. Let's go back to mtg.design. Or maybe in both files, I'm not sure. But whoops, it's an ambush. It's Marcus's card. Crypt Kitten. I actually didn't notice this was Marcus's card when I picked this card. When I went to go look at it, I was like, "Oh, dang, this person's on the video right now." Okay, so I'm gonna talk about your card. What I like about it. I like this on a micro level and a macro level. I guess I'll give those terms. And what I mean by that is, uh, on the macro level, it makes me go, all right, now I don't know whether ninjutsu is going to get me or ambush is going to get me if I block or not. So now I'm freaked out. What do I do? Now, here's the micro level here. Now, if I wanted to block and I was afraid of this card, I appreciate that there is more than one reason to be afraid of this card because I may have 0 cards in my hand, but this creature has death touch, so I can lose my creature if I block with it. If it only had discard a card at random, I may not actually be afraid of it happening. Conversely, uh, I may not be afraid of the death touch, but I have some sweet cards in my hand. I got 2 left. They're both great. Maybe I have just the one like chump blocker, and that gives me another reason to be afraid of of this card. Now it doesn't get all the cases. There's could be the token deck that played out their whole hand and they all got saprolings and it's fine. But I appreciate that there's more than one way to be afraid of it.
Yeah, I know a lot of custom designers have explored um, like ambush or sorry ninjutsu but for blocking space, and what I've heard from most of them is that it drastically slows down games and makes people less willing to attack as compared to ninjutsu where it speeds up games and encourages proactive play. And it's another thing where like the attacking versus blocking seems like such a small difference, but it completely changes the dynamic of the mechanic. So yeah, I'm not a huge fan of ambush as a mechanic. I think that if there is a card which it would be good on, it's something like this where it's like uh, you get to yoink. It's essentially like you get to Doomblade something while also getting value on the death, and it's just a fine card to play out on its own on raid. But yeah,
I think in order to make ambush work, you probably have to have some cards that have like pretty natural counterplay to it, just printed in the set. Um, Things like creatures blocking or blocked by, um, or no, creatures blocking such and such guy get -1/-1 until end of turn or things like that. Um, because that's like a state based thing, then even if an ambusher comes in, they get made worse off by it. And you would just have to design your knobs very precisely around making sure that there are creatures that can safely attack in, and also that there's like ambush cards that you want to play that play specifically to ambush effects themselves. So like counterplay to what is on rate a very good defensive trick to be able to do.
Yeah, I was gonna highlight this card as well, and then I saw, oh, it's Mark's card. Maybe he'll talk about it at the end. But actually, initially I thought it was just blocking, but basically it's attacking or blocking. But yeah, flavor's spot on. I think black cats get a bad rap, honestly, but
Yeah. I made the same actually made the same error in my head when on ambush, it rewarding you for blocking with a creature rather than having your creature get blocked like ninjutsu. Maybe I would like to only have it be if your creature got blocked, so that people will be more likely to attack rather than be afraid to attack.
Yeah, that's an interesting knob. I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, Mark, what's your next card going to be?
My next card is in the Magic set editor files. It is Delusion. I really enjoy that this is kind of like a discard 2 spell that has a really wild thing that it leaves behind. I love the line of text, as long as a card left an opponent's hand this turn for this thing's become a creature clause. And just the sinking suspicion of this like variably existent or non-existent creature, even though it's probably pretty manageable for you as an opponent to make this a creature and kill it. When you get into the later game and you don't have land drops to freely turn this into a creature, or you don't have like a creature spell into a removal spell as your way of answering this, it becomes very hard for you to interact with. Obviously, you can just like swing in and like second main phase your spells, but then if your opponent has ways of making you discard spells, they can get a Kraken with a 4/4 at some point. It's challenging though, because even then, like consistently making this a 4/4 can be hard on your opponent's turn, because you need to have cards remaining in order to have it become a 4/4. So there's this challenge of like, they want you to have cards left to discard where you want to go hell bent, but then if you go hell bent, then they know that they're safe to do whatever else their game plan is. There's a lot of play to this in a way that like I would need to play test in order to know what the actual like texture of the card to play is, if that makes sense.
No, yeah, and it's like interesting because like you can't actually use its ETB to do something good with it being a creature for the most part, unless you have like at the start of combat, if you have ferocious, do a thing. But that seems very not blue black. So yeah, I feel like it's one of those cards that intrigues me, but I wonder what more there can be like done to tweak it to make its play patterns a little bit more there, I guess. But yeah, shout out to
Maybe.
Shout out to Gateways 7
Go
for its
ahead.
design. And it's also part of a vertical cycle of blue black enchantments they designed for this, starting with Unease at 2 mana, Delusion at 4, and Paranoia at 6 mana. For those listening to check out in the files.
I feel like this would be really hard to attack with unless you can find some way to entice your opponent to play a spell. And probably the only play pattern I can think of would be this would be really good against counter spell decks, like decks with a lot of counter magic to it, so that, main phase, cast something kind of powerful. If your opponent counters it, then you can swing in with the 4/4. But otherwise, part of me almost wants to have it be a 4/4 until the next turn, like, so that way you can, I don't know, still do things. No, actually, I'm totally reading this wrong. I guess what I'm trying to say is, it's not a blocker. It's only an attacker.
And even then, it's kind of hard to make be an attacker. What do you guys think of? I definitely think like whenever a card leaves an opponent's hand, this becomes a 4/4 until your next end step or something might work.
Right.
Yeah,
The
that
other
sounds
thing I
pretty
was
hype.
thinking, maybe, but this one might be a little bit too hand county, is if an opponent has fewer cards in hand than you. But
Sure.
like the bookkeeping on that one can be a little bit more of a pain in the butt.
Let's see. Yeah,
Yeah,
blue likes to draw cards, so uh trying not to overdraw. Or no, it's when opponent has less.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. All right. So you're incentivized to play divinations and okay. Hopefully they don't feel bad for playing lands.
Okay. Ancestral. What is your next card going to be?
Well, I'm going to choose this card, although I don't think it's balanced. I think you'd have to tweak some knobs, but I think the idea is interesting. And that's Helaene Fanatic Chemister. This is on mtg.design. It tap Helene to draw 4 cards. You get 3 poison counters. Choose an opponent at random. They gain control of Helene. It is a partner, a 0/1. And this is really hot potato. So this is your your you gain control of Helene and you want to get rid of Helene. Except I guess a little bit different because the 3 poison counters. So it's sort of it is extremely black. You are totally willing to take to self inflict in order to gain card advantage. 4 cards is way a lot of cards here. So I maybe 4 cards is always worth the 3 poison counters, but again, once you get to 10 poison counters, that's it. And as a partner, maybe that's a little strong, but on the flip side, a 0/1 is not very useful especially in Commander.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of this card at all, and the main thing is that poison, unless it does something gradual or uh, ha- gives your opponent some way to give you poison counters, is just a really free resource, even freer than life, because at least there's so many ways to pressure life totals. Um, with poison, it's just like, oh, yeah, the first 3 activations of this are literally free. So it's just like giving an opponent it is like having to give an opponent it is obviously a downside. Um, but I think overall the poison counter thing is like mostly trinket text, and if anything, it's just gonna like if it results in the same person randomly getting control of it a few times, then it's like, oh, that person's just winning the game. So yeah, I don't know. I want to be positive about lots of cards, and I think that most things have like a good design seed that can like be moved into something. This one, I'm not seeing it.
I'm scared of this in the context of like a homeward path or a sack outlet. Because if you just get to Helene 3 times, um, then the game is over, like pretty categorically. Um, and yeah, that just I don't like the idea of like a person getting 9 poison, their opponents having no poison in their EDH decks, and them kind of getting away with like doing a heist on the game. Um, I do like the idea of like if you replace poison with like you lose a third of your life rounded up.
Sure.
Here's
Um,
a um, here's a positive aspect here. I agree. Those are valid points with the poison. If only you can get like player infected, and it's going to slowly drip into a fatal blow. But the thing I appreciate about the passing to another player, besides abusing it with besides using synergies like Homeward Path and stuff, is this partner part is really sneaky cool in that sometimes it's like it's a nice feeling to be able to have your commander and for commander purposes of course in front of you, and you're like emboldened by like this is my peep. But if you gave it away and then the opponents just start passing back and forth, at least you have your other commander still, and you're still able to use that. um and you're not just left with nothing for bolstering your own deck synergies.
what would you think if this granted creatures your opponents control have poisonous 1.
Well, actually, I was going to say, what if you just put an infect counter on one of your creatures when you pass it? So that way, if they activate it, you have a threat on the board.
I like the poisonous suggestion or the infect suggestion. Yeah, it gets back to what I was saying about like, yeah, all of a sudden you have a way to proactively pressure, and it basically turns into kind of a pseudo monarchy, where it's like that person has the thingamabob, get them. And I specifically like,
Cool.
and I like the creatures your opponents control have poisonous more so than the infect, because infect it's very easy for person with like even a slightly large creature to just knock you out, while the poisonous makes it feel like you're safe as long as you don't have control of her, but as long as you do, opponents are going to start chipping away at you, um, and just like yeah, it has that monarch dynamic of like flipping over who's the arch enemy. Okay, so we just hit an hour, so gonna do a lightning round to finish off the episode. Um, and I think I'm gonna start off with in the MSC file on Death's Doorstep, um, designed by InfinityChef. It's 3 white and a black for a sorcery. It has flash as long as 2 more creatures enter the battlefield this turn and destroy all creatures. And I like the idea of like kind of representing paranoia by having it be like responsive as like creatures enter the battlefield and you're like slam the door shut, slam the door to hell shut kind of thing. um, so yeah, and it just feels it's a very straightforward functional design, but one that carries a lot of flavor in a simple way, so that's why I was a fan of this card.
This was on my short list, and I think that this card like really captures paranoia pretty perfectly. And my immediate temptation on seeing this is like, oh, I'd love to see a cycle of this has flash if punishment clause.
Yeah, it almost feels like the not really a fixed trap, but because like trap from I think it was Return to Zendikar, or maybe it was original. No, it was original Zendikar. Um, was like cool in its own way, but I think that I think that like this has kind of all of the upside and doesn't have some of like the potential gameplay issues that Trap did. So yeah, big fan.
I like that you brought up trap. I also like how this differentiates from traps in that all traps have an alternate mana cost that you can pay when the condition is fulfilled. This does an elegant way of, oh, we're not stepping on traps' space here, even though we could. It's fine, but we have a way to not do that by just saying flash.
Yeah, it's interesting. We don't really have much for flash board wipes, very much, but I think this is kind of a good way to counteract decks that a lot of times the creature decks can just snowball just more upon more. So I think that and sometimes even just token generation. Certainly, I think there's I don't know. I do like this idea.
I like what the mirror existence of this card would do if you were playing an aggro deck against a control deck on turn 5, and you're just like, well, I'm not playing this second creature, or this token making guy is going to sit in my hand forever now. And you just like you're forced into this position of respecting your opponent's 5 mana, um, because if they have it, you're just like, oh, I'm done.
And it also makes this as a control player, you're like, man, should I tap out now and potentially let them drop a haste creature and kill me, or what if I leave up the mana, but then they don't put a creature on and they just swing at me, and then I left up this mana for potentially nothing.
Yeah.
So there's like, yeah, it has that dynamic. But yeah, Bradley, what is your last card going to be?
Okay, let's get over to Magic Set Editor here. This one is Curse of Conspiracy by IEMCD or Ian. So this one costs 1 blue. First of all, I have no idea if this were in constructed environments, if this would be too dangerous against affinity decks, but maybe Marcus, modern expert, would know. But I do appreciate here that blue can polymorph things, and hosing all the artifacts still leads to a way out of it. It's not useless stuff. You get to draw those cards. And on the flavor note here, with the art being so old timey, and the flavor text showing someone convinced that there's a note somewhere in a vase, somewhere in the house that the servants are leaving. This reminds me of someone being so convinced when I read The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. That has the old timey vibes as well. So great package.
Yeah, this was also on my list, so I'm glad that someone else brought it up. It's a really simple hoser, and I think that turning artifacts into clues is just like such a fantastic way of like representing the kind of functional fixedness that you can get when you're like really scared. It's like, oh, like you're seeing everything as a potential threat rather than what it really is. So yeah, I thought that was a fantastic way of representing the flavor, and I think yeah, it does something pretty cool functionally as well. But yeah, Mark, what is your last card for the day?
My last card is Collective Sentence. It's at the beginning of each player's upkeep, they may sacrifice a non-land permanent. If they don't put a doom counter on Collective Sentence, then it deals damage to that player equal to the number of doom counters on Collective Sentence. So I like the idea of this like spiraling out smokestack style effect where any player can throw out stuff in order to avoid the punishment of it. And it seemed like it's just going to be something that gets like more and more worrying over time, to the point where once you get far enough in this thing spinning out of control, you're going to reach a point where you're like, okay, well, I have to hold on to this thing because I need to get rid of it to this. And if I don't have this, then I'm going to take lethal damage to how much damage this has become. Specifically in multiplayer games, this starts to spiral out to like, assuming that nobody pays it early on, then like 2 turn cycles, it's probably hitting for 8 at that point. And obviously, like the moment that someone gets like a little afraid of the damage and they start paying it, it doesn't get bigger as quickly. But by that point, everybody is starting to pay it, and it's starting to really smokestack out.
Yeah, I think that this is. I think it's a cool way to like do a Punisher effect that gives the opponent a choice, but is still you're ticking down meaningful resources in life and board stuff, and you can, as the player who casts this, you can very easily uh, mitigate either both on your end or the opponent's end. So yeah,
I think there's a few of these limited cards where it, I think Vengeful Strangler was the last one we had, where basically every turn you have to decide, am I going to sacrifice a thing or lose life? And so this is sort of a way, but it escalates a lot higher. In a way, this is very much almost like a hot potato, except you have to, right, you're going to have to keep sacrificing things. And eventually it just becomes, you have to kind of pick the worst of two evils. Eventually, right? I mean, it's literally just a ticking time bomb.
Do you think this should say they may sacrifice another non-land permanent, or besides collective sentence because it's in black and red? Do you think because the controller can say, "Oh, I'm going to turn it off now. It got too dangerous."
Yeah, that scans. I thought you were gonna go for sacrifice and non-token permanence, so the it
Oh,
gets
there's
really
that too.
dicey. But yeah, I
Hey,
agree. I think that like
non-land, non-token, non-enchantment permanent. There you go.
there
We're
we
safe.
go.
It's dangerous and spicy.
But yeah, I didn't notice that it had that knob, but I totally agree. I think if it's a collective sentence, then everyone should join in having to take the Punisher.
Yeah.
Um, I kind of like that pattern of like the smokestack effect where eventually you choose that it stops. Something about that, because like obviously you're going to, as the player who controls this, you're going to take at least a few slugs from it. So you are going to be playing the game with everybody. It's just I don't know, there's something I like about that. Like you have control over this like mutual problem that is making everybody's life worse. And so if it makes your life too much worse, you can quit it. I like that pattern a little bit just as like a thing to do.
See, my
But I
thing is,
definitely think
oh,
it's I think it's like a valid knob for like the power or like what you're trying to pursue in the play pattern.
my thing is, you already get to mitigate it for yourself by like building the deck around it, presumably. So you probably have a bunch of stuff that make throwaway permanents or that do aristocratic stuff or like Doom Traveler stuff that make it easier to just like throw away stuff to your collective sentence without having to take the damage. So I think that like letting them sacrifice itself as well feels a little bit too much getting off scot free. Like I think there should be that punishment where it's like, well, okay, if someone manages to wipe your entire board even when you're building around enabling this card, then you take your beatings essentially.
See, I was thinking of it in the other direction where because it's four whole counters ticking up before it comes back to you, your first turn of this being around, you are going to take a bigger slug than anyone else did. And so because of that, I was thinking of it like, oh, well, giving you like this ripcord that you can pull means that even though you're likely to be taking the biggest slug from this each time, um, you still, I don't know, feel less bad because you have this sense of agency or this hand on the steering wheel.
I guess, but also like if you have like even a one like again like if you build and I'm even thinking of this in like one I think I was thinking for 1v1 but the consideration of even in multiplayer like sure you're taking 4 damage which is the highest that's been there so far but then you've built your deck around this so you just sack a clue or something to it or even if we add the non-token let's say you sack like um, what is
Field
there's
globe.
yeah and then you're just like okay cool. And then the next person has to take even more damage. So if you like, you can. I think that the idea is that like, if you're building your deck around avoiding the damage by playing a lot of like sackable non-land permanents, you never ever have to care about the damage unless your opponents meaningfully interact with your board. And I think that like, so I don't think that the argument of like the damage goes up as it goes around really applies. But
Yeah, I
yeah,
think that's fair.
okay, Ancestral, what card are you going to finish us off on?
All right. Well, maybe I shouldn't bring the card up, but I feel like if we get to talk about Mark's card, maybe we can talk about my card. So it's a late entry. If you refresh, it's on the page in mtg.design. This is the name is a nod to I believe a spell in Dungeons and Dragons, but this is Obscuring Mist. So it's green blue enchantment. Each creature card players own have morph. Morph cost is equal to the mana cost, and creatures enter the battlefield face down. So I was just trying to go for a situation where you just don't know what creatures are coming onto the board. Everything is a 2/2 until you pay mana to flip it. And I think there's a lot of guessing as to what your opponents are going to do. And I think that could be rather interesting.
Oh yeah, I'm ready. I'm ready for the fog of war.
There's got to be some way to make it so that you can put a creature spell onto put something onto the battlefield and have people not know what it is, because as is currently morphs have like a sequence that they come in as. So like if you oh gosh, if you cast a creature spell face up and then it gets put onto the battlefield face down, people will still know what it is, for example. I don't know how would be the best way to do it so that you can make it unclear what's what, though.
Oh yes, that's right. You can still cast with this, right? Um,
Oh, I see what you're saying. There's a problem because you can't tell if you can't verify there's a creature. Hmm.
Well, no, it's not about verifying there's a creature. It's that if I want to cast a creature face up for the mana savings, I can do that, and then people will know what it is. Or if I bring a creature back from the graveyard, or if I like if my opponents know what a creature is, because it's been face up at any point, uh, then it being brought face down by obscuring mist doesn't actually obscure it. It just makes it a little memory issuey. Um, so I don't know if there's like
yeah, we can fix that. Yeah, or I have an idea. I have an idea for it. But yeah, so avoid me going. I cast Raging Goblin for 1 red mana. Then it enters the battlefield as a 2/2 face down. To get rid of that, can we add another line that says, uh, creature cards can't be cast, or however it is, creature spells can't be cast, and that way they have
um,
to use the morph to put them on the battlefield. It's okay with the graveyard thing you said because people already have seen it or other things, but I think that gets rid of a lot of the general problem that you're talking about.
yeah, it'd be like face up creatures can't be cast, but that works fine. Yeah.
Okay, and I think with that, we're coming to the end of this episode. So once again, thanks y'all for joining me. Thanks Ancestral and Cajun for setting up the systems that we have in place for people to submit cards. And again, if you want to know more about that, plus find all of the cards we talked about today and more, they're linked in the description. But other than that, I don't have anything else to say. Do you guys have any finishing comments?
Cheers, everybody.
See you all tomorrow, where I believe our theme is Duel. Fight you then.